Hi, good evening, guys. For the test review, I just want to go over probably the most mistaken, which was section B, which was about demerit goods and taxes on it. So I thought this was kind of a tricky one, right? Because it's a combination of indirect taxes and demerit goods. So let's start with unpacking the demerit goods part. So demerit goods refer to things like alcohol, cigarettes. Let's go ahead and, for the sake of simplicity, just say this is for alcohol. So what the heck does that mean? Well, it means that for items like alcohol, producing it for the companies that are producing it and for the society, the number of wineries, the number of breweries, it's all the same. It doesn't really have a different impact between these two parties. However, you'll notice when it comes to societal benefit versus private benefit, there is this little gap here between these two lines. And what this gap is representing is what we learned as a negative externality. To be exact, a consumption negative externality. So what does that exactly mean? Well, what it means is the people consuming the product, which is alcohol, versus the people who are not drinking, have a different amount of impact, and that the net impact is a negative for the rest of the people who are not drinking. So what would that mean? Well, for example, you have things like drunk driving, right? Drunk driving is a prime example of where someone who is drinking could get an accident, and that's also bad for them, but also it's impacting the rest of society. Another example would be if you have people become alcoholics, then they're not going to be able to work, right? If they're a student, they can't study, and that will end up impacting their family or their university, etc. So this gap here is representing that. So right now what's happening is if we just let the free market run the way it should, we're going to end up producing 170 units of alcohol. The problem with this is that we don't want 170. We want to be, when I say we as a society, we want to be where society meets society. So that would be this point right here at 90 units. So what this means to us is that we are producing 170, but we want to figure out a way to produce lesser, right? We want to have 90. So in comes tax, right? So this connects to question 15. First of all, how do we calculate this tax? Well, the way to calculate tax is quite simple. Here we have MPC, this line here. Then over here we have MPC plus tax. So the difference between these two lines, right? How can we measure that gap? Well, can we find a place in the line that connects? Yes, we can. Right there to right there. That gap right there in green. That is $4.10 to $3.10. So yeah, not the most difficult math question there. That gap is $1. So that is how much the tax is. So this is sometimes called a sin tax, right? Where the government's essentially trying to get people to curb their consumption of a product they consider being unhealthy for the rest of society. So let's talk about this tax. If you look at the tax rate here, you just have to look at the box that covers the area above, right? That connects the two lines here. So this is obviously the right part of the rectangle. So this is the cost for the consumers. So this is what the consumers are paying it. I'll call PC. And then way down here at 310, this is the price for the producers. You might be wondering, wait, Mr. Harris, there's a big gap here, right? And you're precisely correct. That gap is indicating this A, and this was another question, right? How much is the tax? This area A, B, C, E, F, G, this area, all of this is the tax revenue, right? This is how much the government is receiving from this sin tax. Now, how we would calculate this is just simple multiplication, right? I just find the width of this is 310 to 110, so it is $1, and then I multiply it by the length, which is 0 to 110. So the amount the government is receiving is $110. Now, let's talk about deadweight loss. Sorry, I should have talked about deadweight loss a second ago, but it's okay. I'll talk about it now. So deadweight loss, let's see what it was prior to this tax. So prior to the tax, it was essentially the space of L and M. The space of L and M, it is indicating to us that we are right now here, right? Our consumption is 170 if we just let the free market, but we want to get, and I always say look for the arrow, right? Essentially it's pointing. You can kind of imagine this arrow, right? Pointing to our goal, which is where SC meets, so SB meets SC, right? Where society meets society. So this area of LM would be considered the dead weight loss. So how to calculate that? Again, very simple. It's almost the same thing we just did with that rectangle. We would look at G. We would look at KHMLR. We would look at, there should be actually a point. Oh, well, you know what? You're actually not asked to calculate, so you don't know this, and that's fine. Because the only point you are asked to calculate is what is the deadweight loss after the tax. So let's talk about that. What happens to the quantity? So we have now this tax, right? And what this tax does is we used to be, and we'll call this 0.1, right? We used to be here at 0.1, but now our sales have shifted, right? It has shifted over to over here to 0.2. And 0.2 means we are now selling 110 units. So in some ways, this is a win, right, for society because we wanted to get to 90. We couldn't quite get there, but we've been able to decrease the units from 170 to 110. Now, when it comes to deadweight loss, what that means is if we no longer are selling, right, this high rate of 170, well, it means all this area here is obsolete, right? It's obsolete. We don't need to consider these areas when calculating deadweight loss because the new deadweight loss, and I know it's getting a little messy here, is this new area in red, right? This used to be L. For those who don't remember, this is area L. This is area L. And to calculate that, again, it's just width and height, but this time we have to divide it by 2 because we're only looking for 50% of it. So the height of this is 240 to 310, so that's 70 cents. I know it's getting messy, but let's just keep going. 70 cents. And then we multiply it by 90 to 110, which is 20, right? 20 units, so 20. So 70 cents times 20 is $14. And then we don't want 14 though, right? Because 14 is the whole rectangle. We want to make sure to divide that by 2, which gives us 7. So 7, I believe, was one of the answers as well for one of the questions, which is the new DWL, the new dead weight loss. Now, what other questions does this have? I think we talked about consumer burden versus producer burden. So when we look at the amount that was taxed, right, this area of A, B, C, E, F, G, you just have to look at the area above this line right here, right, above the original equilibrium of 360. The A, the B, the C, the upper part, this section is the consumer burden. Let's see if we can put in a new color here. I'm just going to write here consumer burden. And down here is the producer burden. Now, I think we can kind of connect this now to actually this point here, the PED. So the actual PED, I'm just going to run through that calculation really quickly. If you guys remember, right, NOO, which is new minus old divided by old. And if you remember, you need to get in the Q before you P, right? So Q is in the numerator, the price is in the denominator. You would simply put in what is the new quantity. That's 110, right? After taxes is 110. Our old quantity was 170. So it's just 110 minus 170 divided by 170 times 100. And then I would divide that by the change of price. So what was the change of price? Well, it used to be, if we scroll up here, right, it used to be 360. Actually, no, I start with the old, sorry. I start with the new, I mean. So now it's 410. It used to be 360, so just 410 minus 360 divided by 360. I plugged that all into a calculator. You should get 2.54. Now, I think this is a great opportunity to also review some of the concepts of inelastic versus elastic. So, and how that impacts this taxation. So inelastic for both supply and demand are products that where price changes, yet demand doesn't change or supply doesn't change. Great examples of this would be something like medicine, especially life-saving medicine. Price goes up, people are still buying it. Do you guys remember, for example, Pharma Bro, right? We talked about it with Pharma Bro. Still devious smile there. Another example of inelastic would be things like gasoline, right? If gasoline changes prices, trucks are still using it, people are still using it to drive to work, etc. Whereas elastic means if price changes, people are going to change their consumption habits. So things with substitutes, right? Let's say overnight, all pizzas increase 50% in price. People are going to start eating chicken. They're going to eat, they're going to eat various other items and not stick to pizza. So same thing with soft drinks, right? Let's say overnight soft drink goes triple. Well, then what's going to happen in that case? Well, in that case, people are going to start drinking tea. They're going to start drinking coffee. They're going to start drinking maybe even beer, right? In places where, alcohol is legal. So when there's alternatives, people are going to, it's more elastic. Now, how the heck does this relate to taxes? How? Why? Well, this is incredibly important because governments want to tax things that are inelastic, right? That's why it's no coincidence that often things like cigarettes, alcohol, these are very inelastic goods, tend to be taxed because people are going to still pay for it anyways. Whereas if you tax elastic goods, great example was, I think it was Great Britain, I can't remember which country it was, but they tried to tax yachts, and the ethos behind it was honorable, right? They said, look, rich people buy yachts, let's tax them. What happened is the increase of tax was something like 30%, but then the whole country had 50% less yacht consumption because people just moved their yachts to other countries, or they just decided to wait. They said, you know what, this tax could be temporary, or maybe instead of buying a yacht, they just decided to buy like a supercar. They decided to buy like a Lamborghini instead of the yacht. So this was an immense failure because, again, elastic products are not good for taxes because if it's elastic, people are just going to switch over to something else. What else? There's a few little things here that I haven't drawn in, so I'm just going to do that very quickly. So how much is the business making with this new tax? They are making essentially the rectangle that is below the taxes, right? Because this yellow is indicating the what the government is getting. And over here, this is what the biz is getting. You'll notice it's smaller, right? The business used to get all of this, right? They used to get all of that, but because of taxes, they've lost it. And then from the consumer end, it's also bogus, because from the consumer end, they used to pay $360, right? But now they're paying $410, and instead of getting $170, now they're getting $110. So they're paying more for less money. So I think that about wraps it up. Yeah, this was a difficult one, but hopefully this was also a good review. In the summer, my goal for the next week or so is just kind of slowly get through those IAs. The goal really is, for you to have some time over the summer. It doesn't have to be next week. It doesn't have to be next week. But, we just kind of slowly make sure so the people want to do early, I'll go ahead and look at it this week. And, then you have the rest of summer. People who are slower, really, if you can do it by July, that's fine. I will be checking my email every day. I might even make a few more review videos sometime over the summer. But that's it from me. Have a great summer vacation. And yeah, hopefully this was helpful in some capacity.